Yeah, if you just want to give me a little bit of...
Clint, would you just say a couple things? Okay, first of all, the phone was ringing, right?
Okay, the way I became involved in this was started out in the early afternoon, around probably 1:30 in the afternoon, and I received a telephone call from the mortuary officer out at the Walker Air Force Base, Army Airfield Base, and he was inquiring about what would be the smallest possible casket that we could get that would be hermetically sealed. And at that time, I know that we had used like the 4 feet and caskets. We had used those before, but I thought they also made them in a 3/6. So, he wanted to know if we had any in stock, and I said no, but if I can make a call to Amarillo, I can have him in, by 7 o'clock the next morning on a truck. So he said, I'll get back to you. And that was the first contact that I had with the base.
And then what?
Then he called back, probably 45 minutes or so later. And he said, I need to ask you some more questions. He said, in case something like this should happen, he said, we need to know what the preparation, what your preparations are for the bodies that had been laying out in the elements, And he said, we need to know also what if your treatments of the bodies or the remains, what could you do to them, and if your treatments, would it change any of the chemical breakdown of the tissues, the blood? Would it make a difference? And I said, I thought probably it would. And I said, of course, he knew exactly how we would treat those bodies because we have an outline from them and what we really have to do. I think he already at that point knew exactly what we would have to do.
Did he disclose to you what he had?
No, I told him. I said, if you have a problem, if you if you have something you don't really know what to do about it, let me come out, and I'll try to help you do whatever you want to do. So, and he said, well, we don't really have anything. He said, we're sitting here thinking in case we should get involved in something like this, what would be our preparation? What should we do? Then I went through. I said, do you really want to know how we would do it? Well, yes, we would like to know. So that's when I explained to him that we would have the vats that we would fill up with formaldehyde solution with water, and we put the bodies in them, let them stay there for 24 hours, and then take them out. And then we would pack the bodies in, would be a sawdust and really a lime. And I got the call, I left the funeral home, and the ambulance went to the scene of the accident, picked the airman up. I did not place him on a stretcher because he had a head injury in the nose. I think his nose was fractured. So I did some minor first aid, and then he sat in the front seat with me all the way to the base. When we got to the base, then he walked into the emergency room. I didn't have to take him in. They didn't bring out a gurney or anything. He just walked in on his own. Then I never did see him after that. Then I had this friend that I wanted to talk to and see. This is a lieutenant nurse that I knew quite well, that had only been there only been commissioned and been out to sign. This was her first assignment out to the air base. And I wanted to talk to her, and so I was going down the hall, and first thing, the lieutenant that I wanted to see was coming out of one room, going across the hall to the other, and she noticed it was me. She said, how did you get in here, and what are you doing in here? And she said, you better get out in a hurry. She said, you're going to get in a lot of trouble. She said, would you please leave and get out of here in a hurry? And then I turned around, and she went on into the other room, about the time I turned around, there was another officer said, "Hey, wait a minute," and I said, "Looks like you had a crash." He said, "I see there's some, in the ambulances out there, I see a lot of wreck." And I said, "Where was the crash?" And he said, "There wasn't any crash." And he said, "Just wait a minute." And then I said, "Wait a minute," and I, stood there for a minute. And he turned around, and evidently he must have waited for somebody else to come out, because there was another officer coming out. He said, "This man says there was a crash out at the base." He said he was inquiring about our crash. And this was when I encountered, he was a red-headed officer, and very nasty, very rough. He said he did not see any crash. There was not any crash. And he said, "You get the hell out of here, and you didn't see anything, and you don't talk to anybody." He said, "You're going to get in a hell of a lot of trouble." And I said, "Look, I'm a civilian. There ain't a damn thing you can do to me about it." He said, "No, but somebody might be picking your bones out of the sand." That's when he made the remark there. Then there was a black sergeant that was standing beside him. And he said, "Yeah, but he would make better dog food for our dogs." And then there was two MPs that joined me right on, took me outside, each holding me by my elbows, and escorted me out back to the ambulance and followed me all the way back to the funeral.
Now, as you were entering the hospital, you saw something, 3 trucks.
Yeah, because usually where I parked, there was 3 field ambulances parked in the area where I usually park, where we back up to the ramps. So I just pulled up to the side in front of those and parked out in front, and the airman and I got out and walked in. So when I got up, went up the steps and up the ramp, and I was walking, going into the emergency room, I noticed that the doors were open, but what was odd about it, there was an MP standing beside each one of the vehicles in the back, just standing there. And the doors were open. Naturally, I was curious, and, I just happened to look in. That's when I saw some debris that looked like parts of a plane or something, that they hadn't had a crash. Because I've seen them do this a lot of times, bring in pieces and the old ambulances in.
Can you describe the debris?
Yeah, I noticed in 2 of the ambulances there was some debris that was probably 2.5 to 3 feet, long and probably high, that was propped up on the side of the ambulance there. They were kind of in the shape of maybe like a half a canoe. They were like the front part of a canoe. And, it looked like it might be aluminum, but it looked more like the metal looked more like stainless steel that had been heated. It was blue, kind of a bluish tint to it. And what was odd about it, it looked like around the curved part in the front of the canoe, there was some designs or something. It kind of reminded me of maybe some Egyptian signs or whatever. And it was probably about 3 inches in high, and probably the length of what the wreckage I saw, it looked like it was the length. And the same thing was in the other ambulance too. I mean, I saw practically the same thing. The pieces that were practically the same size, and the insignias looked like whatever that might be was part of the wreckage. Well, I didn't know really until the next day. And I called out. I kept trying to get a hold of her because naturally I was curious and I wanted to know what was going on. And so I called out the next day, and then probably around 11:30, she said, "I know you've been trying to get a hold of me, but I haven't been available." And she said, "Why don't you meet me at the officers club? If you have time, meet at the officers club, and we'll have lunch. And I want to talk to you." And the funeral home we had at that time, we had some of the businesses there had an associate membership to the officers club, and our funeral home had that membership, and also had a card to identify myself and what business that I was, associated with. So I had no problem. One time I'd go to base, all I had to do, a lot of times if it was in the evening, I'd have to stop and sign a visitor's and get a visitor's pass and then turn it in when I left. But there was no problem going out there. So I went on out and met her. Beg your pardon?
Tell me about lunch.
Well, we, both ordered. I'm not sure, remember what we ordered, but it was just a light lunch. But she was so upset. She looked like she's, in shock is what she really talked like and looked like. And she said, I said, well, I was just curious. The only reason I want to talk to you, I was curious on what happened. And she said, well, you won't believe it. And she says, I don't believe it either. But she said, I got in a lot of trouble on this thing. I'm not real sure about this. But she said, then she pulled out of a little purse or little pocketbook, whatever she had there. She gave me a little diagram that she had drawn some figures of some arms and face and so on. She told me that this is what, was what was in those, that it was a crash. It wasn't an airplane, but they didn't know what it was at that time.
These were bodies.
Yeah, but she said we have 3 bodies. There was 3 bodies. She said 2 of them were very mutilated. One looked like it might have walked out, or that it, might have lived a little while. And she explained they were like 3.5 feet to 4 feet tall. The 2 of the bodies were you couldn't identify much because they were practically destroyed, and it looked like maybe that they might have been a predatory animal or something might have been doing some damage on the bodies too.
How did she describe your head and hands?
Well, she said the head, in the little drawings that I had, the way she explained it and the way she drew it, that the heads were somewhat larger than a human heads. The hands were long, no thumbs. It was just the long, very delicate fingers at the end of on the underside at the tip of each finger was a pad-like, maybe a little pad, but it looked like the skin had maybe little suction, like the little suction cups on those. On the, no fingernails on the hands. The head, the lips were just a long, narrow, more or less, not full lips like we would have in most of our people, but very fine lined, very fine lips. There was no teeth. That was the inside of them.
Did she recognize any of the doctors by examining the body?
She told me, she said, I asked her that question, which of the doctors, and she said, I don't know that I knew them, and that was her answer. So, but she said she walked in the room and they said, hey, we need you need to help us. And that was the way she became involved in it. And then she got ill. The doctors also became very ill. They would have to do a little examination, then they'd have to leave and go sit down, and then they would come back and do a little bit more. It was that bad.
After your conversation with her at lunch, can you describe what happened that day, how you were unable to see her again?
Well, yeah, we'd visited a while, and then I had to get back to the funeral home, go back to work, but then I never did see her after that. And I called out the next day to see how she was feeling, see what, and they told me that she wasn't available. Then I wouldn't be available that day. I called the next day, and they told me that she'd been transferred. And it was rather odd because she'd only been at the base less than 3 months. That was her, on commission less than 3 months, and that was her first assignment. So it was rather odd that she would be transferred out, within 3 months. So
Later on, I guess you got a letter.
then about 2 weeks, probably 2 weeks, at least 2 weeks. Could have been a little longer, but I know it was at least 2 weeks. I got a letter addressed to me at Glenditas at the Ballard Funeral Home. But she didn't sign. It didn't have any returned address or anything on it. But inside of the letter, it was just a note. She said, "I don't have time to write. I will write later. This is my APO number." and that was the extent of it. So then I wrote back to her and asked her more or less how she was feeling and why the sudden transfer, and then I hoped that she wasn't in any trouble. It was just a short note. I really didn't go into a lot of detail or anything. Then probably 3 weeks or probably a month after that, then I got the letter that I had mailed to her. It was returned. It was stamped return, and also it's in red printing it said deceased. And that's the last time I ever heard anything about it.
Did she express an opinion as to what she thought these beings were? Did she think they came from the...
Well, the only remark that she ever made was that they definitely weren't humans as we know humans, but they could be from another planet. Or the doctors were explaining this, that they couldn't be from our planet. They had to be an alien, or had to be something else, but not in our planet. Well, she said that, well, of course they were, first thing she said they were black. They were just as black as they could be, but probably laying out in the elements in July in Roswell with 105 to 110 temperature every day and 80 degrees or so at night. I mean, that wouldn't be uncommon, because we picked up a lot of sheep herders of people that have been found dead that's laying in the desert, for days and bitten by rattlesnakes or whatever. And they do turn, as black as they can. And I know exactly what they were talking about, because with the smell and the odor being so drastic, because this is a very unpleasant situation, And well, she said that, of course, their eyes were set back into the skull. Oh, and it was remarkable. I thought it was interesting also that she said their skulls, the doctor said their skull bone structure wasn't like ours. It wasn't actually a bone. It was probably a real heavy cartilage. It looked more or less like a newborn baby. The skull was very pliable. You could mash on the skull and it would give. And so the bone structure, bones are not like our bones. It was our skull and everything. Said very fine, very delicate. The arm bones, like the radial and the elbow in the arm, that was so fine that he doubted if they could lift. She said they doubt if anyone at that size and the arms at that could lift 50 pounds on the earth or anywhere else. They doubted if they had that strength. But she said the one that hadn't been mutilated to a great extent, it reminded him of a real small ancient Chinese person, no hair at all, and very, very delicate skin. In fact, he said the skin would look like they could almost see through it, almost transparent.
Why don't you give me a paragraph on the ears?
Well, the ears, like I think I stated to you, that the ears, there was a couple of small orifices, one on top of the other, with two little lobe flaps, one over the other. They didn't really know if they had any significance, how they worked or what. They didn't go into that. The nose was only a couple of very small orifices, holes right there, just above the lip line. But it had, there wasn't anything covering it. And it was just like two small indentations there, and that was it. Said it was very unusual.
You're talking about the hands.
Yeah. The hands, well, there was one hand. There was one hand that evidently wasn't attached to the arm.
Por favor, sígueme en todas mis redes, ya que tengo más contenido que te puede interesar. Saludos y hasta pronto.